Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. 3 eggs found in a nest at Elmendorf Lake have halted plans by the city and Joint Base San Antonio to remove cattle egrets from the West Side Park that have been identified as a risk factor for aircraft using nearby military runways. I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News reporter Liz Teitz to learn more about the story. Liz, thank you for joining me today here on the podcast. Let's start with a brief description of these birds and why they're in the San Antonio area to begin with.
Well, thanks for having me. So the cattle egrets are some of the many birds that travel through and spend time in the San Antonio area, which is on a central flyway migration corridor. So we attract a lot of different species, but these particular cattle egrets tend to come in spring and stay through the summer and fall in the San Antonio area, where they build their nests and breed, and then they'll migrate further south and then come back usually in around the late February, mid-March timeline. And so they have particularly taken a liking to this area in Elmendorf Lake, which is often referred to as Bird Island, where there can be up to anywhere from 800 to 1,200 of these birds during kind of the peak season.
Now, for anyone with a connection to the Air Force, military aircraft, the idea of birds being an issue wouldn't be much of a surprise for them. For me, it really came by watching the movie Sully, and obviously all that happened with the Miracle on the Hudson. So tell me about what authorities have said when it comes to the risk factor that happens when these birds are in the area. And they've actually had documented aircraft problems in the past, specifically with this species, correct?
They have a pretty small percentage of the overall number of bird strikes that have been recorded in the last couple of years involve these specific cattle egrets, but overall the number of bird strikes is on the rise. And the reason this particular population has been kind of identified as a problem is where they're living and where they're feeding. And so when they travel from this bird island to, it's a landfill that they've been found to feed at, and they also feed in some of the agricultural fields that are near this landfill. And on that flight, they pass through and over runways at both Joint Base San Antonio at Lackland and at Kelly Field at Port San Antonio. And so for planes that are either landing or taking off from those areas, these flocks of birds, which can number in the hundreds when they're traveling together, or they can be individual birds, but either way, as they make that pass, they are crossing over this runway.
And so there were dispersal plans that were put together. This has been something that's been talked about for a little bit of time. And as I mentioned at the top of today's program, eggs have been discovered. So how does that development change the situation?
Sure. So the plans involved using a lot of different factors to encourage the birds to essentially move elsewhere. So that was things like using lasers or pyrotechnics or loud noises or predatory bird calls, as well as trimming back and cutting down some of the tree and brush on that island to make it a less appealing place for these birds to nest. The problem is that once birds are breeding, they're protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so because there were these eggs found on the island, they basically have to halt the mitigation plan because they can't, do anything that could negatively affect the breeding of these birds on that island. And it was not actually, or we believe it was not actually a cattle egret that is laying eggs yet. Most of them have not arrived and migrated here. But because there's another bird breeding in that space, basically they have to put a hold on this plan until the breeding season ends.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting reading up on this story that the eggs, they aren't proven to be actually from this specific species. And that's something that I think has come up in the discussion, correct?
It has, yeah. I mean, that's also part of this situation is that people who are opposing the plan to remove the cattle egrets are also raising the issue of, well, what about all of the other birds? Elmendorf Lake and the Bird Island area attract many other species, other types of egrets, herons, cormorants, a number of species. And so there's been questions raised about, well, how can you try to target this one particular very large population without affecting the others around it? And so I believe it's a different type of egret that has laid an egg on the island, but that still has triggered the Bird Protection Acts.
Of course, when talking about this situation, focusing mostly on the birds themselves, another key component are the people living and working around this area. Residents near the lake, they've been upset about communication regarding the plans to disperse these birds. But the city disputes at least some, if not all, of those allegations. What have you been able to find out about that part of the story?
Yeah, there's a bit of back and forth. From the city's perspective, they have been leading up communication. This is a multi-agency plan. It involves obviously the military, but also the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services and Texas Parks and Wildlife. And the city, which is heading up communication for that, has said, we've contacted residents. We're holding these 2 community meetings. We're making sure that people know about this. And what I've been hearing from people nearby and in kind of the more of the bird enthusiast community, including the Audubon Society, is that they were brought in fairly late to the game. The plans had already been developed and it was already decided what was going to happen to these birds before they had any chance to weigh in. And so they feel like, just getting a flyer saying that there's a community meeting is not sufficient when they could have been involved earlier to say, well, what else are you doing? Are there any other ways that you can approach this that, protects the public safety aspect and protects the military, but also, preserves these birds, which people, see as a wildlife, a part of a part of the park that is a natural space and, wildlife that they think should be protected and, treated with respect.
So, Liz, as we've mentioned here, we're kind of at an impasse, a bit of a pause on this topic because of the discovery of the eggs, whether or not they're cattle egrets or different bird eggs. But they were discovered, and that kind of pauses the situation. So that being the case, what are the next steps for those in favor of dispersing the birds going forward with these plans, as well as those, as you just mentioned, who might be opposed to some or all parts of that plan?
So at this point, nothing is going forward. There are some different interpretations of that federal law, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that could potentially allow for some modification of the habitat on that island, specifically the tree limbs and branches. But for the most part, and to the extent that we've heard from the city, everything is on hold. And those birds are breeding and typically stay and raise their fledglings through October. So at this point, we've got quite a long impasse ahead. The city is working on a plan to formally collect input and formally collect feedback and suggestions from people in the community or anyone else who they think should be involved or wants to get involved. And for the opponents or the people who think other plans should be considered or looked at, this is a chance for them, they say, to kind of voice those to the city and voice those to the other agencies involved and try to see if there are any other alternatives that might, balance those 2 needs. And I talked to the president of the Bear Audubon Society who said, maybe this is a chance to do a little more research, to study these birds and study their patterns and see if they can find out why they're so attracted to this place, or see if there are changes that can be made in the landfill that would alter their flight path. And so this might be kind of an opportunity to develop a little more of a comprehensive approach to moving these birds.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News reporter Liz Teitz for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.